And welcome back again, everyone. Welcome back to the Exploring Consciousness Based Applications for Climate Action workshop. Once again, I'm Mark Cruson. I'm your host again for this session. We have with us here Mark Boccuzzi, who will present ethical considerations of applying psi to environmental protection. Mark works at the intersection of applied parapsychology, cutting edge technology, and interactive media. His goal is to normalize, optimize, and utilize psi experiences and abilities to create a more compassionate, sustainable, and interconnected world.
Hello, I'm Mark Boccuzzi, and I'm speaking to you today from Tucson, Arizona, where I live with my wife and research partner, Dr. Julie Beischel, and our two rescue pups, Ada Grace and Toggle. Before we jump into this presentation, I want to go over a few quick definitions just to make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to use the word psi a lot, which is actually the Greek letter psi, and it's an umbrella term for phenomena which include telepathy or mind-to-mind communication, clairvoyance, which is any real-time information about a distant location, item, event, or person. This is sometimes referred to as remote viewing. Precognition, information about a future event. Retrocognition, information about a past event. And psychokinesis, often abbreviated as PK. And we break psychokinesis down into three separate parts or three different levels. Macro PK, which are large-scale effects which are visible with the naked eye. Micro PK, which are quantum-level effects. And bio PK, sometimes referred to as direct mental interaction with living systems, or DMELs. So the thing that's important to remember about psi, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis, is that these happen outside of our known motor sensory channels. Psi also seems to function in two modes. There's what we call explicit psi, which is the conscious effort that we put into acquiring psi information or causing psi effects. And implicit psi, which happens in the background outside of our conscious awareness. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. The area of science that studies psi phenomena and experiences is known as parapsychology. I'm currently defining parapsychology as the multidisciplinary study of a set of experiences and phenomena that challenge our basic assumptions about the fundamental relationships between consciousness, matter, space, and time. I should say that this definition isn't widely accepted by the field, but it works for me at the moment. I should also mention that parapsychology not only studies psi phenomena, but has an interest in phenomena and experiences relating to the survival of consciousness after bodily death. This includes things like mediumship, near-death experiences, reincarnation, ghosts and hauntings, etc. So one of the first questions that comes up when you mention psi is psi real? Well, for the purposes of this presentation and talk, I'm going to say yes, it is real, but we don't fully understand it. I'm not going to spend any more time defending the existence of psi, and if you're new to these concepts or this field, there are a few books I would recommend to get you started. One Mind by Larry Dossey, Dark Cognition by David Vernon, Real Magic by Dean Radin, Transcendent Mind by Amance Baruch and Julia Mossbridge, and The End to Upside Down Thinking with Mark Gober. If you get through these 4-5 books, you'll have a good, solid foundation of the field, and they are wonderful jumping off points if you want to get into more specific areas or more technical details. So in this talk, I'm going to try to address this overlapping space between what we call applied psi, ethics, and activism. And when you interact with these three areas, it does tend to raise a lot of questions. And I'm going to talk about those issues today. And my goal here isn't to provide you with answers, but to give you things to think about as you put your projects together or you start working in this field more. And this is going to be a very high-level conversation. I'm not going to get too hung up on the details of research protocols or specific experiments. This is big picture stuff today. So speaking of big picture, I'd like to put forward this idea that you keep in mind this idea of whole systems or whole systems thinking, and not fall into the trap of compartmentalizing some very specific effect without thinking about how it interacts with the system, with the other parts of the systems. And I think this is especially important when we talk about psi and its effect on people, the environment, non-human animals, and the rest of the biosphere and geosphere. I don't think we can affect one of these things without impacting all of them to some extent. So try to keep that in mind as we go through these topics. All right, so let's talk about the ethical considerations of applied psi. For my work, I tend to break things into two categories. There's research that we conduct in the lab, and then there's application development that we conduct out in the real world. Now, laboratory-based research is expected to follow all local, state, and federal laws, but we're also held to a higher ethical standard. For example, if I develop an experiment that incorporated non-human animals, that experiment and those protocols would need to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACOC, before I could move forward. Something similar would happen if I were to develop an experiment that required human research participants as well. That would need to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Now, in application development, of course, we still need to follow all state, local, and federal laws. However, this adherence to a higher ethical standard, or the idea of ethics in business, becomes a little bit more murky, because just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical. So for me, this creates a fundamental question right out of the gate whenever we start application development, which is, given the unique nature of psi, is a higher ethical standard needed for applications? So when I talk about ethical research, what do I mean? How do we determine whether or not a particular experiment is ethical or not? Well, there are 4 sets of criteria that are tested for every experiment. Those include autonomy, or respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and nonmaleficence. And I'll go into detail about each one of these in a little bit. So how did we get to the point where researchers were held to this higher standard? Why do we need this extra level of ethical review when we conduct research? I want to just point out 2 quick examples from history that brought us to the point where we are today. The first is the Nuremberg Code, which was in 1948, and it was established after the trial of German physicians who willingly conducted deadly and crippling research on prisoners. It's the first international document which advocated for voluntary participation and informed consent, and we'll talk more about those things in a bit. And then from 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study was conducted. Here, 600 low-income African-American males, 400 of whom were infected with syphilis, were monitored for 40 years. Participants were actively denied treatment even after a cure was found in the 50s. So those are just 2 examples from history. If you want to know more about how we ended up in this place where researchers are held to this higher ethical standard, I'd recommend the book The Ice Pick Surgeon by Sam Keen. And it talks about a number of examples where researchers have have given up their humanity in exchange for the pursuit of knowledge. I want to dig in a little bit more into these 4 ethical principles that are used to evaluate research. But as I do that, again, I want to remind you to keep in mind this idea of whole systems. And while these ethical principles were really drafted with human beings in mind, I think it's appropriate to consider their application across multiple domains. Let's go ahead and put some definitions next to these various principles, and we'll start with autonomy, or respect for persons. Individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. Persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. In research, we accomplish this through a process known as informed consent. During that process, participants are told what is expected of them during the study, what data are going to be collected, and how those data will be used, that they have the option to opt out of the study at any time, and that they should be free from any sort of coercion. Beneficence. Research should maximize benefits and minimize harms. Individuals should be informed of risks and benefits before volunteering. Justice. Risks and benefits must be distributed equally. No section of the population should get special treatment. Nonmaleficence is an obligation not to inflict harm on others. So let's see how these basic ethical principles can be applied to consciousness-based applications. In his book, Subtle Activism, David Nichol proposes the use of consciousness-based practices to facilitate collective change. Now, these practices include meditation, prayer, and ritual. Now, typically, these types of practices are used for personal development, so it's an interesting idea to try to apply them on a larger scale. There's one term I just want to make you aware of if you haven't heard of it before. It's called the Maharishi effect. And this is a set of experiments or interventions in which large numbers of people came together and meditated, and then they looked at things like crime rates or terrorist activity or violent actions in the areas where those large-scale hundreds, if not thousands of people meditated. And what they saw was that those areas showed a decrease in violence and in crime. And so there's been a number of studies that have been published over the years about the Maharishi effect. Now, I don't want to go into detail specifically about a specific study or the limitations or strengths and weaknesses of the protocol, but I want to take a look at these, the application of meditation, prayer, and ritual on sort of an operational level. So let's dig into that for a second. So on the ground, what does this look like? So as an example, let's say we have a city that has a rising crime rate, and we have a group of consciousness-based activists who want to help reduce the crime in the city through meditation, prayer, or ritual. So they might set a specific intention or desire or say a prayer to reduce crime by at least 20%. Now, we would say that that creates a form of consciousness field that then would permeate that location. And so that the next time they check the crime rates, and they find that there actually was a reduction in crime. So what does this mean operationally? Well, because of a psi intervention, resident behavior was altered in such a way that it reduced the crime rate. So reduction in crime rate is good, but how does this model hold up when we evaluate it using these basic ethical principles? Well, let's look at autonomy. The residents had no informed consent, and they had no way to opt out. This was something that was simply inflicted upon them. And some residents may have been morally opposed to being part of something that included a consciousness-based activity. So for those reasons alone, the autonomy test fails. It's also difficult to measure or assess risks versus benefits given such a narrow metric as crime rate. There was nothing else that this study looked at to help understand the impacts of this intervention on other parts of the population, whether it be the residents or the meditators. Also, did all the neighborhoods have equal burden? And do all the residents have equal access to care and support should they need it? And since psi still isn't fully understood, there may be yet unknown harmful impacts. So overall, this intervention doesn't stack up well when we use basic ethical principles as a litmus test for its viability. However, even though this doesn't pass our ethical litmus test, there are actual benefits from a reduced crime rate in a location. For example, it lowers the costs to the city, it increases property values, and it increases the quality of life, at least for some of the residents. So this raises a bigger question. Although it may not be ethically sound, do the ends justify the means? Is it okay to deny someone's autonomy if it serves a greater good? So the question becomes, for me, can these types of ethical principles coexist with the application of meditation, prayer, and ritual? Or do we need to consider something else? Let's move on to the next topic, which is the implicit and explicit nature of psi. In this example, we have a group of consciousness-based activists who are interested in an intervention involving meditation, prayer, or ritual. And in this case, they've set a specific intention to form, to increase the sense of community in a given location. This agreed upon intention would be an example of explicit psi. Everyone in the group is committed to a specific outcome, and they're putting their mental focus on that outcome. However, in the background, we may also be experiencing implicit psi effects. These are effects that are caused as a result of a person's deep-seated needs that they may not even be consciously aware of. So in this case, maybe there's someone in this group that doesn't particularly feel comfortable with all the people in their community. So there's a conflict between their implicit needs and their explicit intent. And when that happens, does that form some sort of confound or create a confound in the intervention that we're trying to create? This all leads to another question. Are trained and enlightened practitioners needed? Can we really expect people off the street to have the clarity of mind, if they haven't been properly trained, to understand the differences and conflict between their implicit needs and their explicit intentions? So the next topic I want to talk about is respect for whole systems. Some of you might be familiar with this book, The Intention Experiment by Lynn McTaggart. And if you've read that book, you may see my name sprinkled around in various chapters, especially those dealing with the effects of intention on plants. After co-founding the Wimberge Institute, I continued my own personal exploration of this idea of intention on biological systems, specifically plants. So I engaged a number of healers and meditators to send growing intentions to plants in the lab. And what we found was that there was actually evidence to support the idea that this focused intention did increase plant growth. However, the plants that were targeted by the intention also required much more watering, and they wilted and died faster. So this brings up yet another question. What are the implications for the environment, infrastructure, and resource management if we were to employ these types of interventions on other types of biologicals at scale? what happens to the other systems that utilize the resources that these intention targets would be utilizing? Weather is another complex system that affects us all the time. And throughout history, we've heard all kinds of reports about people being able to affect the weather or request rains or bust clouds. But it was only relatively recently where we had the technology to track those effects. So I went through a number of examples, and I cherry-picked one that I thought would make my point about the impacts of psi on complex systems. And this one has to deal with prayer, and specifically it's Pat Robertson prayed that Hurricane Gloria would move away from Virginia Beach back in 1985. And while the hurricane did not actually impact Virginia Beach, it did change trajectory and hit Long Island instead, and this resulted in 8 deaths and over $9 million in damage. So the carbon cycle is another really complex system that exists in our world. So what are the implications if we insert psi into that system? Are we actually solving problems, or are we simply passing them along to someone else, like the hurricane that hit New York? So the next topic I want to touch on is this idea of activism versus slacktivism. So slacktivism has been defined as the desire people have to do something good without getting out of their chair. And I envisioned consciousness-based activism today to include a lot of possibly online or in-home activities, whether it's people meditating on their own or using apps or getting online to participate in some sort of group activity. And then once those consciousness-based actions are completed, then the activists would go back and participate in the rest of their lives. What's interesting is that recently, Brookings published an article in which they stated that about 2/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are linked to household consumption. So what that means is the possibility that once a consciousness activist has completed their activities for the day and they go out and go around performing their regular tasks and activities, they could potentially undo all the good that they've done through their activism. So the question now becomes, do we have an obligation to encourage consciousness-based activists to engage in real-world actions that reduce their carbon footprint? And that may take the form of education or other kinds of programs that allow them to take an active role so that they don't undo all the good that these programs may be doing. So this next topic is kind of personal, and it's a tricky one, and it's this idea of openness and open access versus covert action. And as scientists and researchers, our tendency is to want to make things open access and available to everyone and engage community and get information into the hands of the people that need it. However, given the nature of this kind of work and the current state of the world, an argument could be made that some, if not all, of these activities may want to be kept quiet and confidential. I'm about to tell a story about a homicide, and I don't know if that's going to be comfortable for everyone, so I put this icon up in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. So I'm going to leave it up there while I tell this story, and you can turn your audio off if you want. I'm not going to use any disturbing images. And then when you see the icon go away, you can turn your audio back on. So I'm going to start that story now. As I mentioned, I live in Tucson, Arizona, and this story takes place in Glendale, which is about 2 hours north of here. Glendale is also the home of the Astrology Store, which is this amazing metaphysical bookstore. It's owned by Dave Campbell and his spouse Ray Watkins, and here that they are receiving a certificate from the mayor of Glendale. Dave is also one of our Wimbridge certified research mediums. He's been on our team for many years. And both Julie and I have had the opportunity to go to the Astrology Store, spend time with both Dave and Ray, and give presentations and lectures and talks at the store. So what I'm about to tell you is all based on media reports and public records. On January 25th of 2020, there was an altercation with a customer in the store. That customer left, but returned shortly after the store closed with a gun. And that customer shot and killed Ray. He then went after Dave. Fortunately, someone called the police, who arrived quickly on the scene, and the shooter was eventually apprehended. When asked why he had perpetuated this crime, the shooter said he was under psychic attack from people at the store and he wanted it to stop. To some, the idea of psychic attacks may seem fringe, but a quick search online shows that there are many books and websites dedicated to this topic. So within segments of the popular culture, this idea is well established. In addition, through my work at the Wimbridge Research Center and the Wimbridge Institute, I often receive emails from people who claim that they are under some sort of psychic attack and are looking for advice. I also want to add to the mix that there's a growing trend where scientists are actually being targeted and threatened, especially climate scientists. So we may be creating this sort of perfect storm of this combination of consciousness-based interventions, which may actually be infringing on people's sense of autonomy, along with the controversial area of climate research. While the fundamental principle of research is transparency, given the current culture, should applied climate-focused psi programs consider enhanced confidentiality and security? So to wrap this up, how do we navigate these questions and this space? What tools do we have available to us that can help us better understand how our actions are impacting these whole systems that we talked about? So we do have some tools available to us. From science, we have our list of basic ethical principles. Spirituality gives us concepts like karma and the harm none doctrine. Even the Bible has something to say about applied psi. For example, Deuteronomy states, "Don't try to use any kind of magic or witchcraft to tell fortunes or to cast spells or to talk with spirits of the dead." So the advice from religion is don't do it at all. We can also look to existing organizations and practitioners for some kind of guidance. For example, in the book The Premonition Code, Teresa Chung and Julia Mossbridge outline a positive precog code of ethics. And other organizations like the American Society for Dowsers and the International Remote Viewing Association both have code of ethics on their individual websites. Since we're engaged in consciousness-based activities, we may be able to draw upon consciousness-based tools. There are some traditions that suggest performing a divination before taking any action so that you can better assess the impact and outcome of those actions. So tools like tarot cards or pendulums may provide unique insight to some practitioners or researchers. We also may be able to use different types of technologies. For example, Choice Compass is an iPhone app that lets you measure your physiological response when you contemplate different questions. For people that need a more methodology-based or controlled tool, maybe things like associative remote viewing might provide certain insights to determine courses of action. To wrap this up, here's a summary of the questions that keep me awake at night when I contemplate the application of psi to climate action. Are the ethical principles used in research compatible with consciousness-based activism? Can we account for the implicit nature of psi? Can we ensure we are respecting the complex systems that govern our planet? Are we obligated to encourage practitioners to engage in tangible, real-world climate-friendly activities? Can we balance open access, safety, and security? What guidance will we employ to assess the ethical and practical impacts of our activities? I'd like to end with this quote from Albert Einstein. Most people say that it is the intellect which makes a great scientist. They are wrong. It is character. Some quick acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Dr. Julie Beischel, my partner in all things, Annalisa Ventola, and the other volunteers at Public Parapsychology that helped put this event together, Dr. Julia Mossbridge for her general support, and despite having a crazy schedule of her own, has the intuitive sense to keep me on my schedule, and the Wimbridge Research Center and the Wimbridge Institute for providing me with the time and resources to put this talk together. And of course, all of you for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That was a fantastic and really helpful presentation.
Mark, that was beautiful. I don't think anyone is saying what you're saying and what you said in that talk. I think it's, I'm so grateful that you said all that in such a beautiful way. And that's not really a question, but I'm just telling you. and I'm curious what you think. I know that there's some climate scientists, like there's the project at MIT. There's a couple other projects that think that it's okay to just do experiments with the climate in terms of mitigation, without getting. It's essentially human subjects research, but without getting permission from the human subjects. So I feel like that's an example of even a non-consciousness-based situation where it's unethical in the sense that, like, we're just going to do stuff to the clouds and, that's fine. And I'm just wondering how you think, focusing on the consciousness, this is sort of different from my question, but it has evolved since I asked it, how you sort of think the consciousness stuff and the practical, like climate science stuff, mitigation stuff that's already happening, how can they interplay to get more awareness of the fact that these are all human experimentation things?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? That comes back to this idea of, well, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical, right? No one owns the clouds per se. So if I want to, if I'm not breaking any laws by shooting a laser into the cloud or whatever except whatever the thing may be, then, who says they can stop me? It's these kinds of questions are really difficult, and I don't know that I have answers, right? I think that was the whole point of this presentation, was to express some deep worry and concern that I have over those kinds of interventions that you're talking about specifically. So I know that may not sound very satisfying in terms of a response, but I honestly don't know. I know how I feel about it personally, but I don't know that this is the forum, or this is it's my position to express that personal belief without being able to back it up with data or information or citations or those kinds of things. Does that make sense? So,
Thank you. I thought that was a good answer, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And quick advertisement, Dr. Mossbridge will be joining us later on. So nice to get a preview of personality and energy. Great wonderfulness. So
thanks,
all right.
Julia.
So this one is from Michael Totaro Jr. And he says, Mark, are processes of carbon intake and oxygen release expedited in intentional accelerated plants which die prematurely? Or Is there no benefit to the processes the plants take part in? Live fast, die young versus a brief life of incredible substance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If I had more time and resources, I really would have liked to have pulled apart and gotten a better understanding of the mechanisms behind what was causing these plants to die quicker. They definitely needed more water, which required more work and attention. They definitely depleted their soil much more quickly. You know, is one better than the other? Is slow and sustained better than a quick growth spurt? I don't know, but I get concerned when we may not have the infrastructure to support lots of product or lots of production in a short period of time, right? What does that mean for? So now we're used to producing things at a certain rate, and now we're producing things 5 or 10 or 15 times faster. How do we move it? How do we store it? How do we get it into the hands of the people? What about other resources that need the water that these plants are now requiring? Who are we pulling that away from? So it's the idea here isn't specific to plants. The idea is that it's these interventions are impacting these complex systems in ways that are difficult to predict and account for until we're kind of in the middle of it. Right. And that's the question, and that's the concern from my perspective.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So our next question is from Gene, and he asks, let's put that question up on the page. Says, the bus of life on planet Earth is hurtling at a wall. Need any passenger on the bus be concerned about canvassing the other riders on the bus about whether or not the brake should be applied before doing so?
Well, I mean,
I kind of see what he's saying, but yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I understand the question, right? So that's up to you, right? I can't lay down a moral set of guidelines for every individual. That's really up to you and your particular sensibility. So I'm sorry, I can't explicitly answer that question because
understood. I mean, I get the point of his question. He's saying, well, if what we're going to do is essentially going to save all life on Earth, then maybe we can do some things that might traditionally be considered unethical.
Well, the bigger question there is, of course, should we be saving all life on Earth?
Fair enough. Yeah. I mean,
I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying, well, the underlying assumption of that question is that life on Earth as it exists today is worth saving. Yet we know that life on this planet has been wiped out multiple times and grown into new and weirder and other things. So right. Again, no judgment on my part. I don't know if it's good or bad. I'm just
totally understood.
So just own the assumption, I guess, is
right. No, that's totally. Let's do another question. The last one I see in the QA, and it is from Josh Maitland. And he asks, when intentionally influencing a system, could you design the target intention itself to have built-in mitigations for potentially negative impacts?
I mean, yeah, but the point here is that I don't know that we know what those potentially negative impacts are, or even that the intention that we're saying is actually a positive impact, right? Like reducing crime in a city, for example, right, may put police officers out of work, right? So now those people have to worry about how they're going to feed their families or go back to school and get training, or depression, anxiety, right? So sure, yeah, great. I can walk down the street and it's safe, but all those people are now in trouble because of it. And I'm just pulling this police officer thing off the top of my head. But the point is that the world is really complex, and we may be impacting it in ways that we haven't fully spent time to understand yet.
And it requires a value judgment, because a lot of people might say, well, yeah, of course, that's fine. I mean, the police officer just go get another job, but someone else might say, yeah, but come on, that might lead to something else in another circumstance. So it's not always, but really good points. And I think when I think of the way I would summarize all of this is we've got to be able to struggle through these questions. And in too many cases, people don't. They just assume, well, all that we need to do is just move forward. It's like, no, you don't just move forward. You have to ask these really important questions that too many times have not been asked. And as a result, that's kind of why we're here, where we are in this disastrous circumstance, because too many people didn't think about the impact of the changes they were making because they were living in a society based on a theorem of profit, not of well-being. Oops, did I throw in somebody else? Stephen Schwartz's idea of, anyway, I'm going to shut up now. And
Mark, thank you so much for facilitating this presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's always lovely to see you. So
you just beat me to it. I want to thank both Marks. As I said before, this is a volunteer-run event, and so Mark, Krusum, thank you so much for moderating. Mark Boccuzzi, we're going to see more of you later, but I really appreciate the time and energy that you've put into a really fabulous presentation.